of the names of the key players in Watergate. Alright, so Nixon for a while has been bugging his enemies. Nixon actually started suggesting to his campaign team that they use their whatever power they had to find out about tax records of his opponents and things like that, which tax records almost brought Nixon down around this time too. Nixon's tax records were exposed that in the previous 2 years he had made several $100,000 for income, but he had paid $700 one year, $800 next year in income taxes. So nowhere near what most people would pay. And we found out that when he became president, he donated his basically personal diaries, his vice presidential papers from before his presidency years to the National Archives, and claimed a several $100,000 tax deduction for that. So that started to look shady. Well, Nixon's plumbers were the people who were supposed to stop leaks. That's what a plumber does. They stop a leak, and they were supposed to go after anybody that might be a threat to the Nixon campaign. And so I've got there that they burglarized Ellsberg's office, the guy who released the Pentagon Papers to the press. And they burglarized the Democrat National Committee headquarters at this Watergate hotel and office complex. Now, we know how it goes. Forrest Gump sees a light that wakes him up. He calls hotel security, and they go arrest some folks. Hotel security did get alerted to the break-in. They called DC cops. DC cops show up and arrest the guys. Actually, some of Nixon's higher-level staffers were in a hotel across the street listening to the whole thing. And as they're getting arrested, his staffers are basically cleaning up their bugging equipment and running out from the hotel across the street. All right, so one of the guys that's arrested is a former CIA or FBI. He's a former federal agent who was arrested with a group called the Cubans, who were Cuban exiles that he had also trained to eventually go back and overthrow Castro. So there's like lots of intricate complexities here and tie-ins with high-level government schemes. But look at the name. He works for CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. Can you think of a better name for a Nixon re-election committee? Well, when James McCord is arrested, that's like eye-opening to a lot of people. And he eventually writes a letter to the judge that basically says there were some high-level Republicans involved. All in all, there were eventually about 50 people or corporations who ended up taking some kind of federal punishment for what happened at Watergate. So after he's arrested, McCord writes the letter. The judge was a guy named John Sirica, who was known for giving the maximum sentence possible. He was actually nicknamed Maximum John Sirica. And the Senate eventually, after this is starting to become a little more widespread, realizes that Nixon might be involved. So they start to go into the cover-up. And a White House counsel named John Dean eventually testifies that Nixon was involved in a cover-up from the very beginning. So within days of the Watergate break-in, that Nixon knows about it, that he's authorizing payments to people, that he had told somebody he could give them up to $1 billion. James McCord, the guy who is the original arrest, somebody actually told him, one of Nixon's advisors, that, hey, influential people in the White House can make sure that you get clemency with your sentencing, and we can make sure that your family is financially cared for. So basically, they weren't saying, hey, Nixon's going to look out for you, but it was kind of saying that without saying it. John Dean's always it's interesting to me because I know y'all feel like 33 sounds old. Being 36, I feel like 33 is young. And he's the guy that's being told by the president, you need to lie for me. I can't imagine that kind of pressure being on somebody. Well, the newspapers are what really keep this story going. The Washington Post and two reporters, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, they kept getting the information from a top secret anonymous source that they just called the paper's deep throat. We know now he was Deputy Director of the FBI, Mark Felt. At the time, we didn't know who he was. All the way up through 2005. When I graduated college, we still didn't know who Deep Throat was, but when you agree to keep a source anonymous as a reporter, you're supposed to do that. These guys eventually got a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting, and Nixon had a suspicion that the leak was Mark Felt, but he did never know for sure. Nixon himself had actually testified on behalf of Mark Felt because Mark Felt had organized some break-ins to expose the Weather Underground, that really radical fringe of the Students for a Democratic Society. So on his deathbed, Mark Felt finally admitted that yes, he was deep-throated, probably to get some recognition for that, and then the reporter said, yep, that was our source. So these are the two guys, Woodward and Bernstein, who keep the case alive. All right. The Senate established a special committee to investigate presidential campaign activities. See, it's headed by a North Carolina boy, Senator Sam Ervin. And while this committee is starting their investigation, it eventually comes out that there is a secret tape recording system in the Oval Office. Well, actually not super secret, but that's going to record everything that's said. And it was voice activated. And when they when they discovered this, they ordered the president to turn over the tapes of Watergate, or any discussions relating to this. There were actually 9 tapes they were ordered to be turned over. Nixon refused. He said that he has executive privilege. It was a matter of national security. Actually, and probably one of the weirdest ironies of American history, up until this time there had only been 2 presidents ever who had claimed executive privilege. That they didn't have to do what somebody in Congress asked them to do. Eisenhower was the second one. I can't remember what Eisenhower's claim was. The first one was Harry Truman. There was a young congressman who was investigating somebody named Alger Hiss, and he demanded Truman give up his State Department records. Truman said, no, I have executive privilege. Who was that young congressman? Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon said, you don't have executive privilege. You can't withhold records like that. And here we go, 20 plus years later, Nixon's claiming executive privilege himself. Now, there's all kinds of craziness going on with a special prosecutor being hired who files a subpoena to force Nixon to turn over the tapes. Nixon orders his attorney general to fire the special prosecutor. The attorney general refuses and quits. And then Richardson, his deputy, the deputy attorney general, he also refuses, and he gets fired. And this is nicknamed the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon basically starts firing anybody who won't do his dirty work. And Nixon eventually replaces Richardson with Robert Bork. Robert Bork carries out the order, and he replaces cops with a new special prosecutor. He actually at first abolished the office of special prosecutor, but Robert Bork felt like he was only doing what he was ordered to do, which was the job of somebody in the Justice Department. Do what the president orders him to do. So he didn't feel like he was complicit in this. He eventually was nominated for the Supreme Court by Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan's nomination was shot down because he was very conservative. Also, people associated him with the Nixon White House. Now, I might have not linked this presently to it, but you can kind of see, where is it, right there, my cartoon hanging below it is Nixon tied up in a spider web of tape reel. So when this tape is ordered to be turned over, of course, Nixon refuses, and then it finally goes up to the Supreme Court. But the House of Representatives has already started drafting articles of impeachment. So Nixon's on the way to being the second president ever impeached. Who was our first?
Johnson.
Andrew Johnson, right. Nixon was accused of, like I said, some tax fraud. So in response to that, he went on TV and said, the people of the United States need to know if their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. And here's her block throwing some shade at Nixon, because when Nixon finally did, after the Supreme Court ordered him to, turn over those tapes, there was about an 18-minute gap. And at first, the gap was blamed on the fact that Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Woods, was using a new transcribing system where she could use foot pedals to play the tapes while she typed them. And supposedly she answered the phone and kept her foot on the pedal and it accidentally messed up the tape. Well, some technological experts said that wasn't possible. There's no way that accounted for the whole 18-minute screw up. So how crazy is this? The U.S. sued its own president. And U.S. versus Richard Nixon, the U.S. loses. Nixon loses, U.S. wins. Nixon has to turn over the tapes. And even without that 18-minute gap, it shows that Nixon was very involved in the cover-up from the beginning. We had a new phrase enter the American lexicon because of this. It was expletive deleted. You could find transcripts of these tapes all over the place. There were several companies that published them. And every time Nixon cursed, there would be a bracket around the phrase expletive deleted. And it's like every conversation had just hundreds of expletive deleted, expletive deleted. He was a vulgar guy. So I've always thought, man, if the part that he turns over still shows that he's involved with a cover-up, what could have been on that part that he erased, or somebody erased? So Nixon finally resigns, and Gerald Ford becomes president. And some people think that Alexander Haig, one of the key Nixon officials, had visited with Ford and said, hey, if you become president, would you consider pardoning the president? And Ford said, yeah, he might be amenable to that. He could probably go along with it. So Nixon resigns. Gerald Ford becomes our first president to be elected again, become the president without being elected to the vice presidency or the presidency. And 1 month later, he gives a full pardon to Nixon, which, that's within the president's power. And people get ticked off. Now, Gerald Ford says he does it to put our national nightmare behind us. A lot of people think he did it because if he doesn't pardon Nixon, that's all you're going to hear about for the next 2 years. And Gerald Ford actually wanted his own presidency, rather than just being sort of like a placeholder while the Watergate scandal was investigated. So what this leaves us with is a deep cynicism and distrust of the American government. Actually, 1 month before Nixon resigned, he took a tour through the Middle East, and he was giving speeches in several Middle Eastern countries. Crowds in Egypt were chanting, Nixon, Nixon, Nixon. And he went to Saudi Arabia. The American ambassador of Saudi Arabia said, here, let me prepare some remarks for you to make at a state dinner. Nixon said, no, thank you, I'll write my own words. Big mistake. The king of Saudi Arabia was a guy named King Faisal. And Nixon gives a speech in which he keeps talking about King Faisal's father was a great king, a great leader of the Arab people. He was involved in the Paris peace negotiations at the end of World War I. He assisted T.E. Lawrence in the Arab revolt during World War I. Great leader, changed the world for the better. Nixon's big mistake was that was the wrong King Faisal. That was the King Faisal who was the king of Iraq, not the king of Saudi Arabia. So the ambassador who had wanted to make his remarks, he said, oh my gosh, he's furious. The King Faisal that was in Saudi Arabia, his dad had actually been the guy that drove out the Hashemites from Saudi Arabia and was seen as a brutal dictator. So Nixon kind of publicly embarrasses himself there. Well, what this leaves us with again is this deep cynicism. Between the Pentagon Papers, which came during the Vietnam War, showing that the government was not being truthful to the people, and the Watergate scandal, we're starting to see that the government definitely is something that can't always be trusted. And Nixon actually, he obviously is a tragic figure for the way he gets brought down. He had some kind of moderate views that wouldn't identify him with the New Right. The New Right that's about to come to power with Reagan, they thought Nixon was too soft on abortion because Nixon was opposed to abortion, but he actually in his discussions with his cabinet members said that he thought it was okay sometimes, and his phrase was like when you have a situation between a black and a white. When it came to gay rights, Nixon was talking about a TV show, All in the Family, where there was an episode where they discussed gay marriage, and Nixon said that he definitely thought it should not be allowed, but he also said we should probably allow it by sometime around the year 2000. So he said by the year 2000, everybody in America is going to be amenable to gay marriage. So Nixon was maybe, cynical, dark in a lot of ways, but he was maybe more forward-thinking than some Republicans at the time. The Watergate scandal also, when we started to see all these crazy government records, showed us that the CIA was doing some underhanded stuff. The CIA had opened up a brothel in San Francisco with two-way mirrors in which they were experimenting with different drugs on the customers of the brothel. But all that stuff is starting to make us so that now we don't usually take the government at its word right away.